Drink anything.
Okay.
Good morning.
Lost? What?
We're getting used to the cues. Why we start. I want to again,
I've been on the ocean
thankful
one
that you're all here, both those here live and those who are watching us live stream. There's been a lot of views online this summer in a lot of our stuff, but this one is getting regularly over 40 and 50 views. So
That's great.
that's really interesting. This is kind of new territory for us, so we're really happy about it. We're approaching Ezekiel, and we're going to take 2 weeks.
Oh,
with
good.
Ezekiel.
Good.
Oh, good. Because
So don't get angry if
I know.
you read through all of Ezekiel. This
Yeah,
early
that's
on. I know, is Lee on yet?
Not yet,
Okay,
not yet.
so
I
Lee-
will let you know though.
Lee wrote,
Absolutely no notes for.
and she said, she's been watching the stuff online because she's traveling, and she said to summarize it, I saw Barbie, loved it. I'm reading Ezekiel. So that was her kind of summary of starting Ezekiel. And we're going to talk about Ezekiel in a second, but I really felt I missed something last week with the sermon. So I'm going to go back and correct. And here's what happened is that right now I'm preaching out at the park, but of course I can't go out to the park, so I tape it on Monday. And I was talking about Matthew and the Canaanite woman. Okay, so we get what often happens then is Adriana then does the production. She puts it out there. I can review it on Tuesday or Wednesday. That's how it works. And I'm listening to my own sermon, and all of a sudden I realize that's an anachronism. There was no such thing in Jesus's time as a Canaanite woman. So I thought, oh, I messed up. So I go back and look at Matthew, and sure enough, it says Canaanite woman, but I knew that was wrong. It'd be like saying, when I was growing up, I loved the Beatles. They were a great Anglo-Saxon band. Now, if you said, I love the Beatles because it's a great Anglo-Saxon band, someone would be looking at you and go, no, that's like old, references, right? The Beatles weren't Anglo-Saxon in a technical sense, maybe. But of course, they were British.
Yeah.
So there's no Canaanite. That's an old phrase. And if you take a look at Mark's gospel, it talks about a Syro-Phoenician woman, which is accurate. She was from Tyre and Sidon. She's Syro-Phoenician. That was the name technically. So then it comes, well, why does Matthew call her then a Canaanite woman? That's why I raised it up here, because we've actually studied these things. It probably makes more sense here. He's trying to make a theological point about the story of Noah and the whole Old Testament, which is written, right? Why? Who got cursed? Remember which of the three sons of Noah got cursed?
Shem.
And his son is Ham.
Yeah.
Is Canaan. Remember, because it was incestuous. It was the child with Noah's wife. It's incestuous. God doesn't punish the son. I don't know why, but punishes the offspring of an incestuous relationship, which is Canaan. And that becomes the reason the Canaanites continued to practice incest. They continued to practice child sacrifice. They continued to worship idols. And that's the justification for the conquering of the land, because the Canaanites were so evil. So Matthew is trying to say something about Canaanite, and this long history of enemies that's even theologically justified. And he can't get there if he calls her Syro-Phoenician. So he wants to say, that whole problem we have between Israel and Canaan, theologically, in the whole Old Testament, Jesus is now doing something about it in the story of the Canaanite woman. So Matthew is trying to say something quite profound, and not so, well, maybe subtle, but profound, in the naming of this woman as using this anachronistic title for her as a Canaanite woman. None of the other gospels use it. He's writing to a Jewish audience, unlike Luke. So he knows they'll pick up the references. Just like if I said the Beatles were a great Anglo-Saxon band, you'd go, what's he trying to say?
Yeah.
Because they're not Anglo-Saxon. I mean, what's Rick trying to, he's trying to say something, what is it? That would have been Matthew's audience. They would have heard Canaanite woman. Oh, Matthew's trying to say something profound here.
You have to know the Old Testament.
You gotta know the Old Testament.
Yeah.
You have to know the references, or calling her a Canaanite woman makes no sense. So here it is, this woman coming from more hostile territory than even the Samaritans. And then we got the dog reference. And the dog reference makes even more sense if you realize she's, for Matthew, a Canaanite woman. So in any case, I felt like I discovered that this week. That came up in Worship Matters. I threw it out there and somebody knew the answer. Just great. So I enjoyed that. Okay, go to Ezekiel. Okay. We're going to talk about history again. History is tough. But let's start with your experience with dreams. Do you ever have dreams that are so explicit, so real, so fantastical? You get up in the morning, you go, wow, where did that come from? Right?
Sometimes.
Do you remember them in the morning?
Only little pieces.
Some. Now, what do we know about dreams?
Should wake up and write it down.
It's your subconscious. Facts down there, come up.
Well, it could be God's way of talking to us.
Well, in the Bible, we see that a lot,
Yeah.
right? Now, we wouldn't want to say all dreams are God talking to us, otherwise, woo. That might be a bridge too far. But sometimes you're kind of shook up, aren't you? You wake up and you realize, oh, that was a significant dream, right? A little crazy. And what do we know about dreams? It's our subconscious trying to work out issues, right? And psychologists and biologists will say it's really important. It's almost like going to an internal psychologist, that your mind's trying to work out the tensions of the day, the issues you're trying to face, right? And this is how, the body's working for our health even when we sleep.
Right.
Now, I have found, especially after Nina died, but also when she was struggling, that my dreams became more fantastical. Probably because you're just trying to work on big issues. House is dying, and then she died, and then all of a sudden the dreams got really interesting. And I took it because I read a little bit about it, that it's just my mind trying to work things out, right?
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if you've been through that, but I think the theory goes that after trauma or after major issues in your life, that's what happens with your dreams. Again, it's your mind sort of entering into its internal dialogue with itself as sort of a psychologist, but as a doctor, and trying to work through the issues of the day. And it brings your mind to rest when you can do that. That's why they say you need the good REM sleep, meaning you need those dreams, because it's like medicine. Medicine goes inside us. Do we see what it's doing? No, but it works good in us. Dreams are doing this. It's like internal medicine. Like I say, it's like an internal psychologist working out these issues. And so when you get good REM sleep, you're basically allowing the dreams and those cycles to heal or work out your issues for you. So it's really important. Now, why do I share that? For no particular reason. Because I had a great dream last night.
I have a continual dream. It's the same thing. I'm in a big building. There's lots of people. I'm trying to find my way out. And I'm panicky because I can't find my way out.
And that's all the time.
It comes every once in a while.
Yep. I think some of us have those recurring
Yeah.
dreams, right? Usually
Yes.
it's we're standing in front of a high school class, completely naked, right? And you're going, oh.
No, I didn't know that.
I forgot to get dressed this morning.
But Kimmy, I've had that same dream too.
Have you?
Yeah, I don't think it's an uncommon dream. It may have different context to it.
Yeah.
But usually for me, and I know this for sure because it's happened so many times, is that the Holy Spirit is also trying to work something through my head of where are you going? Where is your compass? What is your objective? What is your destiny? Because you're caught in this maze, and the maze is all confusing, and I need
That's
a
the house
pathway
in this
out.
case, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, so there's a revelation that's ready to birth out of that. And there's a question attached to it, you know, and very often what I'll do is I wake up at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning and I've got a pad of paper, a little bunch of Post-it notes like this, you know, right next to my bed, and I write down what happens. Sometimes the message is so powerful, I literally have to get up and go to the computer and write it.
Oh,
Wow.
Because there's
Do you
a-
write any of these down? No?
Yeah, write it
I
down.
sometimes regret not writing some of these down, because I do know some people who do.
Mhm.
And I'd love to go back over several years, you know, and review, because there are some that I had different stages of my life that were very repetitious like those. And some of those have gone away, but then other ones replace it.
Or the other one will come back after a while, the old one.
Have you had that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You're not
Dream
gonna
in
share
color?
it, you're gonna.
Yes,
You do, yeah.
I do.
I can levitate my dreams too. It's like I can actually, I can levitate and I can, it's like I'm sitting outside my body and I can reflect on what's going on. That's kind of weird.
I can fly.
I can fly.
Oh, the flying
Me too.
dream is
Yeah.
marvelous.
I love those.
I do, yeah.
I just love it. Yeah, that's right.
Not there.
I just wave it real fast.
I
my
wanna
arms
get
and
quiet.
take
And
off.
then you worry about how you're gonna laugh.
No,
No.
then you're upset when you
It's not
wake up
false,
because
so
you're
it's
having
not.
such a good time flying around the world, you know? It's, yeah, so in any case, why do I share this? Because this is how I approach Ezekiel. I think we're seeing his vision here in Ezekiel. And it's like a powerful dream that he's seen. Do you remember the trauma of his life? Do you remember, did anyone do any prior reading? What's he gone through now that's been so difficult?
His wife died.
His wife died when he was in exile,
Yeah, in one day, gone, boom. And you couldn't mourn,
and he wasn't, he was told not to mourn.
Right.
Not to tell anybody.
Mhm.
So.
Why?
I sure didn't get that,
No,
because they had a whole culture.
I know.
But nobody was
Built
supposed to
around
mourn. That
mourning.
was God's command.
Yeah, so he obeyed God and didn't
Yes.
mourn.
So, you know, not a lot of comments, you know, everybody, of course, takes a shot at it to explain it. But I've never been convinced by any of them of what's going on there. Obviously, you know, and some people have gone through this. The one example I can think of is you're going through war. You think about World War II, or you think about the Ukrainian war, and you find out that your husband died on the front lines. But everybody's going through massive trauma, and sometimes then you can't mourn. There's no space, and so people will say it wasn't until the end of the war
Afterwards, yeah.
that I could mourn. And you'll see that trauma with soldiers, right? That a buddy will get shot and they'll see that. And you can't mourn, you gotta keep fighting, right? And so then after the war is over, all of a sudden, that's when you have the dreams. And that's when the guy, your friend, pops up in the dreams. Because now you're having to resolve these things you've been carrying with you that you didn't have time to process. That's the only explanation I can have of why he's not allowed to mourn, because he's supposed to be mourning for the whole people,
Mhm.
not just as a husband for a wife.
Right.
And I hold that lightly because I'm not sure about it, but that's the only way I can process that one, right? And sometimes you can't mourn for something that's important to you because there's something bigger happening,
Yeah.
even though that's the most important thing for you. In the scope of your whole life, there are other things going on that trumpet, so to speak. So we've got So the history here is a bit important. Again, there aren't too many dates in the Old Testament we really have to remember, but these are a couple of them. First of all, always 586,
Yeah.
right? Right now, the north has been conquered. Only Judah remains, the two tribes in the south, just Judah. And that's where we get the phrase Jews, right? It's from Judah. They are destroyed in the temple. So sometimes we just hold on to the one date and we don't realize Nebuchadnezzar had been conquering and hauling off exiles, for 20 years.
Right.
So what happened? So remember, Assyria came and destroyed the northern kingdom. And they start
From Judah.
losing the power of their kingdom in 605. That's not a date you have to remember. Other than we get that, we're going to have to remember some of this when we read a lot of the prophets, because this is all part of the prophetic tradition, right? So some of our prophets are going to the north and prophesying early on, while the Assyria is in ascendancy, and then later prophets are in the south. So one of the questions always when you read a prophet is, are they in the north or are they in the south? And there, there's a couple hundred years there going between one was destroyed and the other was destroyed. So here we're in the south, just Judah, two tribes, 605. Assyria, I meant to say, loses its dominance. I think I wrote that up wrong. It lost in
612 BC.
Yeah, okay, there you go. It's the opposite. So 612, Assyria loses its dominance and Babylon takes over with that great Nebuchadnezzar, right? And most of us can remember Nebuchadnezzar because we learned it in Sunday school, right? Geopolitical story. So when Assyria is losing its dominance, Israel goes, I think we'd like to be independent. Right? Now and often what happened is, they wouldn't conquer you if you pay tribute. That's what most nations would do. They just pay tribute, meaning massive taxes. And then the Assyrians would say, we'll leave you alone. But now they've lost their ascendancy. Babylon is now coming into prominence, and Israel goes, this is a good time for us to say we're not going to do that anymore.
Yeah.
You got to be pretty strong to pull that off.
Yeah.
Or you need good friends. So we know now today to compare what's going on, you got to have friends in high places. And so most people will align with the West. We hear that all the time, which means usually Europe and the United States, or you can align with China now, right? Or Russia. And you saw what was the meeting this last week with the economic group, like with Iran and Russia and China and India and Brazil.
The BRICS countries.
The BRICS countries, who are trying to align over against the West economically, so that there's an alternative to Western economics strong. So why is that important? That's what's happening here.
And it's doomed.
Israel,
Doomed because too many evil leaders are involved in that.
We'll attack each other then after a while.
so here we've got a similar situation, basically. Can Israel stand up to Babylon by itself?
No.
Of course not. Not big enough. But with a big friend, who carries a pretty mighty army and a big stick economically, you might be able to pull that off. Who could stand up in this time to Babylon?
Only us.
I'm talking about back in the day.
Egypt. Maybe.
Egypt.
Maybe, yeah.
Exactly. So they're going to make an alignment with Egypt.
Right.
Now we remember later on, Isaiah is going to go, what are you thinking about?
Their past with them hasn't been so great, to be honest.
I think the argument from Isaiah was Egypt's got all these evil rulers. I mean, it's about character, that can you trust an evil ruler in Egypt to come to your defense in hard times, right? So, I mean, part of that was the Republican debate last night. You heard that as well. Yeah, I'm not taking sides. I'm just saying there was a debate on, should we be friends with Ukraine, Remember that?
Mhm.
And so however you answer that, and how the Ukrainians answer that, can we trust the United States as an ally? Or any of our allies, can they trust us? What does that mean? That's all being worked out here. So Israel says, we're gonna be independent. We're not paying to the Babylonians anymore. We need that money ourselves. We'll build up our armies and we'll align with each other.
That's the title, last king of time.
Nebuchadnezzar does not like that answer, as he wants his tribute. Plus, he doesn't want a buffer state between him and Egypt, because he wants it all.
He wants to-
So, in 605, Nebuchadnezzar comes and wipes out Judah, but doesn't completely destroy everything. He takes away a lot of slaves, a lot of people into exile to use in Babylon. That's like the Romans used to do, right? That was free labor, basically. That's in 605.
Until they were outnumbered by slaves.
Judah rebels again. And so he has, you can just see him, I gotta go back there and beat up on them again. It's the bully going back, right? To beat up someone again to get their lunch money, right? So here it is, and that's in 598 to 597. If you're watching this online, again, the first time Nebuchadnezzar comes is 605. And then basically 7-8 years later, he has to come again because Judah was just a rebellious population. They had that independence streak. You don't be ruled by anybody. So Nebuchadnezzar comes in the second time. And I believe that is the 605 is when Ezekiel is taken on the first round. But it might be the second. I have to check at that. But in one of those two, Ezekiel is taken captive. So what has not happened yet? The temple's still there. Because Nebuchadnezzar doesn't want to burn Judah to the ground yet. It's only when Judah rebels the third time, he's going, okay, I've had it.
The people of Judah still believe that God's with them because the temple's still standing.
Still
Yes.
temple.
Yeah.
And what does the temple represent? God's presence. Now, that's a tradition, even now, that's like, goes back to David, goes back to 1000. So God's presence was in the tabernacle, it goes back farther even. God's presence is in the temple. So if we have issues, we go to the temple, we offer sacrifices, God is there, God is with us, God lives in the Holy of Holies. That whole tradition is pretty powerful. So they rebelled the third time, and now Nebuchadnezzar says, that's it, that's it, that's it. And he comes in and wipes out Judah, wipes out Jerusalem, wipes out the temple. So why is Ezekiel so interesting? He's taken away, again, I believe it's the first wave of exiles. And what was his job?
He's a priest.
He was a priest. So he knows the temple traditions, he's participated. He's not just doing it as someone who values the tradition, he's actually participated as a priest. He's taken into exile. He's there for 5 years. How old is he now?
30.
30 years old. He's still a young man.
Yeah.
He was taken away at 25, right? He was taken when he was 25.
Yeah.
So he's sitting by the river in Babylon, feeling down. And I think he goes to sleep and has a vision, this traumatic, fantastical vision of what comes down out of the
God's
sky?
throne.
Yeah.
God's throne,
Dark.
4 living
Oh,
creatures.
okay.
The 4 living creatures, which we normally associate with Revelation, but where did Revelation get it? Ezekiel. So it all goes back to usually one source. So this is pretty amazing, and one of the things that we'll pick up in the video here in a second, in that God shows up in Babylon. Ezekiel is clear. God has left the temple. Big deal,
Yeah, that was true.
big deal. Where is God now? God is with God's people in exile. That's where God lives. With the people. It's actually, that goes back to the original vision of Adam and Eve in the garden. So this is pretty dramatic, even for a priest, because you think the priest would go, no, okay, is God with us? Yes, but only in a residual sense. God's still in the temple, God's still back there, in Jerusalem. And Ezekiel predicts that the temple will be destroyed. And now God shows up in Babylon. Ooh. So that is part of the storyline here of why Ezekiel is so revered. He's one of the major prophets. So the problem with the major prophets is Lee on yet?
Not yet.
Okay, as Lee said, hard to read.
Mm.
So if you try it, it's hard to read. You've got history, but you also have these fantastical visions, these images. And Ezekiel, that's my third point, is like an artist. But there's some, you go into an art gallery, you can see some paintings and they're easy to read. He is one of those that's complex to read. And you've all seen art pieces, you look at them and you go, what is this? I could do this.
It is.
And then the gallery owner comes and says, well, it's a little bit more complex than that. Do you know the whole history of Western art and all, how this fits into whatever it is you're viewing? And you go, no. And then it comes the hard question. Are you interested enough to stand longer in front of that painting and study it? And Ezekiel's one of those that some people say, no, it's just too complex for me. I can't keep reading it because I just don't get it. And others say, I'm going to dig in deeper and deeper and try to discover what's in the gold in this mind. Again, because it's a major prophet, these are the ones that are being read and influence Jesus. Jesus reads Ezekiel. He reads Isaiah.
The Son of Man, he says.
Son of Man. He's getting that from Ezekiel. And so here's our temptation. What is the one text we always read from Ezekiel every year?
37.
Dry bones.
Yes.
And because it came to us through the gospel, gospel music,
Sunday school too.
them bones, because it some of us can identify with that image, of this dead, of soldiers who have died on the battlefield, who have been left. This horrific image, and then all of a sudden the Spirit of God blows over these dead bones and they start to rattle and move. And sometimes if you've gone through that type of experience, you go, oh, I get that. I felt like that before. I felt like I was down and out. And now, God's breathing new life into me. I'm starting to feel good again. So that's the one image we often take from Ezekiel, but also the beginning here, and I want to read that, Ezekiel 1, and then Ezekiel 2, we're not going to read that. But out of chapter 2, Ezekiel's call is important because God tells Ezekiel, nobody's going to like your message. Oh man, it's like devastating. It'd be like saying, Rick, I called you to be a pastor, but nobody's gonna like your preaching.
Back to the wall.
Well, I think Ezekiel was stoned to death by his own people and he just wasn't on.
They don't mention his death.
I think that's what happened, but I'm not sure.
I have to look that up. But he wasn't loved, so it fits, at least it fits the storyline that, and so he is, remember that he's an artist. So he paints these pictures, I think coming from his dreams, which are pretty fantastical, but then he also does street theater, right?
I just love that.
Say why you like that,
Oh
Kara.
man, laying on his side, just acting it out. Have you ever seen a street performer?
A mime.
Yeah, well,
They're fantastic.
yeah, San Francisco, they're all over the place. I just love it. Whatever they think is happening to them is interesting.
In the 60s and 70s, we had happenings. Does anybody remember? And I I grew up in a parsonage, pretty sheltered, I would say, and had no cultural bearings whatsoever when it came to the art world. And a senior, I was a sophomore, a senior in our youth group at church, Trinity Lutheran in Norfolk, Virginia, said, I want to take you to a happening. And I went, okay, what is that? So we walked in and it was a lot of street performers, basically. But you didn't know, you weren't prepared for it. So I walked in, there was a statue, it looked like an ancient Greek statue of this naked woman, until I realized it's not a statue.
Oh, it's- What was the sixties?
So I never, yeah, it's a 60, so I knew, I'm not, Toto, I'm not in Kansas anymore, right? What's happening? And so there was constantly these surprise performances. That's what a happening was. It was always these kind of performances live. The art was acted out. It wasn't on a wall to admire. And so here what does Ezekiel do as one of his performances? You were talking about it, Karen.
He laid on his side.
For how long?
For a long
A
time.
long time.
Is
yeah.
it like a
Yeah.
year? I mean,
Yeah.
Exposed his naked-
And how did he lay down? I mean, it was, I think he's all tied up. So he's bound up. And then he also cooks on top of dung.
Don't make bacon.
Yeah, and so he's making an impression. Okay, we're still talking about him lying in the street, wrapped up and cooking on dung. That was the point, that it wasn't just preaching or writing or a vision. He tried his best, I guess you could say, to dramatize.
So he actually did that. Oh, I didn't read it that way. And then he rolled over on his right side.
Yes, yeah.
I thought it was a vision.
Again, it's like a street performer. Now, every once in a while, you get a street performer who will actually come in and do something on a stage. So they have to be quite dramatic. And I remember one guy, he was the first act of two, and he came out and just laid down on the stage. So the curtains open up, and there's this guy just laying on the stage.
390 days on his left side and 40 days on his right
Yeah,
side.
right now.
Yeah.
I bet he had bed sores.
I think the idea though is then, I'm going to work every day and I walk past Ezekiel and go, hey, he's still there. Wait a minute. I think he's on the other side today. That's amazing. All last year he was on his left side, and now whatever it was, he's on his right side, now he's on his left side.
Rick, we call those people homeless.
Except if you know that homeless man was your priest back in Jerusalem.
Mm,
You don't have to question his sanity.
Well, that's probably why nobody took him serious.
mm.
That's a good idea. People didn't take him seriously.
Yeah.
That's a good thought.
I mean, even look at Hezekiah with Isaiah and stuff. He just tell him you're wrong, throw him in jail. Or whatever. Yeah.
So-
You're wrong, throw him in. I mean,
Just imagine, suppose Rick
Yeah.
did that. Suppose he said, instead of preaching, I'm gonna lie down right in front of the church here and to make a point. Well, how long would he do that before we started to say, Rick,
We need a new
wake
guy.
up?
911.
April City would come in there.
2
and,
years,
yeah.
2 years at least.
Like one of those Greeks with the grapes,
I think it heightens it because it would be not here in Naples, but what if we had tried to make this as realistic as possible? So let's say another hurricane comes and we'll all have to leave Naples. And now we go to FEMA camp someplace. And then all of a sudden we're walking through the FEMA camps, we're all struggling, to kind of reestablish ourselves. And there's your pastor lying down on the ground, bound up, cooking on dung for a long time, because there's a message, right? It's all about the message. So someone might say, well, your pastor's really committed, or your pastor's really crazy.
we need to commit him to.
Yeah, exactly.
Or you'd say, I knew him before, guy when he was a nice guy. Now, we're not sure what's going on there, but we pray for him every night, you know. So I'm sure all that's going on surrounding Ezekiel. And he's trying to garner attention to his message, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of the text for this Sunday where Jesus says, who do people say that I am? Right, and so are people taking him serious? Christ, right, on every turn, I'm gonna die in 3 days. Peter didn't even take him serious. And I think that's that weird tension between God's word, because it calls us to do things. And a lot of people look at us and say, well, you're crazy. And sometimes it never pans out. Somebody says, I'm going to pray every day for such and such, and maybe something doesn't change. But then that prophetic, scary edge is, oh, by the way, he was telling us that Babylon was going to get us. And guess what? Now it's happened, right? Or so forth. So that's a hard edge, right?
That the temple will be destroyed, because they had already defeated Judah. Temple will be destroyed, and it happened about 7 years after he prophesied it. So that's not like 100 years later. I mean, that's so it probably, and who was the one who prophesied it? It's that guy down there in the dirt.
But I also think that there's a very fine line between sanity and insanity. And sometimes people that are brilliant, they have that little edginess in them that you look at them and you say they're different.
Fool's the twin of the wife.
And I just think sometimes it's, for me, I have to be quick not to judge that because they have an extrasensory perception. I just read a book on hospice and how all these people were dying, and before they were dying, they had the vision of their loved ones. And the nurse was very new and naive, and she kept saying, they're out of their mind. No, they weren't out of their minds. So if we see something different, we're very quick to say they're different. And I think sometimes you just have to step, I have the chills. You just have to step back and just listen a little bit. And maybe it's not in tune with what you think, but that doesn't mean they're wrong.
That's just such a great point, because I know, by the way, Ellen Wolf, who some of you know is in hospice
Oh, she
now,
is.
she's dying. She'll be dying in the next couple of days, if not already.
Oh, I just went to see her.
Yeah, she's at Solaris. I'll go
Yes.
right after the session here. And I mention that because many, when they're dying, will say, I just saw an angel, or I just had a vision of my mother, or,
Yes.
and she's sitting there. She's sitting there now.
Yes.
She's sitting there now.
And because you don't see it, we say, well, it's not true. No, it is true. They're seeing that. It's true.
I think that's part of this Ezekiel tradition, again, where he's gone through trauma, lost his wife, lost everything as a priest. The temple now he's prophesying is going to go, and then he has this fantastic vision. Melissa, would you read just the first 9 verses, just so we get a sense of the beginning of the book, of how quickly he moves, right, into his vision along the river.
This is chapter 1, right?
Right.
Okay. In my 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Khebar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah,
Jehoiakim.
yeah. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Bliese, by the Khebar River in the land of the Babylonians. There, the hand of God was on him. I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like a glowing middle, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight. Their feet were those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved.
That's how he begins.
Whoa.
It's pretty dramatic. Pretty dramatic. So I didn't have time. I was gonna, first of all, we're We're grateful that Freeney is here, by the way. She's going to do backup to Howard whenever Howard's not here.
Okay.
Freeney is learning the ropes this morning, so it's glad that you could join us. Because they were working on it, I wanted to get a couple pictures. Artists have had great fun with Ezekiel, right? And it fits our day, because I don't know if you go to see every, like the Fantasy Four and all these movies, you know? You like those, Jim, right?
Back from Dallas.
What,
Like what, Marvel or?
Marvel movies, right?
Oh, yeah, you're right, yeah.
So this is kind of a Marvel movie type of image, right? Fantastical, unbelievable images. He's doing what Marvel does now with comics and movies. He's doing with this vision. And you can imagine he goes into such detail. It must have been, I think, at one level, captivating for his hearers, because he's using the oral tradition. He doesn't have a movie set, you know, or a Marvel comic book. He's got only his verbal skills of painting this picture of what's happening. So pretty dramatic.
I just wanted to say something about King Jehoiachin. The relevance of him, he was the line of David. He's the one that sat at the table with Cyrus out of Isaiah. Just
Good.
that's how the line was preserved.
And remember, this was a tradition that, you know, you bring everybody into exile, then how you treated the king, the foreign king, was interesting.
Yeah.
Sometimes you respected them and sometimes you put them on a pike.
Yeah.
Or the one, was it Hezekiah, they killed his two sons in front of him, that'll be the last thing you see, and then he burned his eyes out with coals.
Yeah.
And that's this dream tradition, because often what we bring into our dreams are the last couple things that happened in the day,
Mm.
right?
Or something you watch on TV.
Yeah.
Or something, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Which is why some people say, don't watch TV.
Right.
before you go to bed. Okay. We now want to watch the tape. Now, there's a lot going on in Ezekiel. Remember, we're going to do 2 weeks because it's so long. My favorite's next week, because it's the hopeful section. And
There's always that part, right?
right, but we're used to that, right?
Yeah.
First half Ezekiel, a little bit judgmental, a lot judgmental, and then the hopefulness for not just Judah, but all the nations and all creation. It's all going to come to play in the second half of Ezekiel, which is fantastic. And then I'm turning to you.
The book of the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a priest who had been living in Jerusalem during the first Babylonian attack on the city. And they spared the city, but they took a first wave of Israelite prisoners and hauled them off into exile, and Ezekiel was among them. So the book begins 5 years after all that, and Ezekiel is sitting on the bank of an irrigation canal near his Israelite refugee camp, and it's his 30th birthday, no less, the year that he would have been installed as a priest in Jerusalem. And then all of a sudden, Ezekiel has this vision. He sees a storm cloud approaching, and then inside the cloud are 4 strange creatures that have wings outstretched and touching each other. And these creatures each had 4 faces. And then he saw 4 wheels, one by each creature. And then he saw that the wings of the creatures were supporting this dazzling platform, and then on that platform is a throne, and then sitting on that throne is this human-like creature, glowing and shrouded in fire. And then all of a sudden Ezekiel realizes what he's seeing. He calls it the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. It's God riding his royal throne chariot. Now the word glory, in Hebrew it's kavod, it means heavy or significant. The biblical authors use this word to describe the physical appearance and manifestation of God's significance when he shows up in person. These images in the vision, they're very similar to what happened when God appeared on Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. And it's also very similar to the depictions of God's presence over the Ark of the Covenant. And that's actually the most shocking thing about Ezekiel's vision. What is God's glory doing in Babylon? It's supposed to be above the Ark of the Covenant, in the temple in Jerusalem. And so the first section of the book opens to explore that question as Ezekiel begins to accuse Israel of rebellion. So God first speaks to Ezekiel from the throne chariot, and he commissions him as a prophet. Ezekiel is to accuse Israel of breaking their covenant agreement with God in a couple ways. Israel has given their allegiance to other gods and has been worshiping idols, and this has all led to rampant social injustice injustice and violence. And so as a result, God appoints Ezekiel to warn the people. The first Babylonian attack that took Ezekiel into exile is going to be matched by another, and Jerusalem, its temple, all face imminent destruction. So Ezekiel uses words and more to get his message across. He also performs sign acts. These were a form of street theater. Ezekiel would go out in public and start behaving in these really bizarre ways that were like parables of his prophetic message. So he was supposed to build a tiny model of Jerusalem and then stage an attack on it. Or he was to shave off all of his hair and then chop it up with a sword. Or the most extreme, he was to play the role of the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement. And he would lay on his side for over a year, eating food cooked over poop, as a sign of the nasty food that people will have to eat during the siege of Jerusalem. And perhaps the most disheartening thing of all is the bad news God gave Ezekiel that no one was going to listen to him. Israel would reject him because of their rebellious and hard heart. And this recalls Moses' description of the people after the wilderness rebellions, when he predicted that exile would one day happen, and Ezekiel had the unfortunate privilege of seeing it all come to pass. And so a dismayed Ezekiel, he begins to perform his task. And after about a year, he has another vision. This one is about the temple. He goes on this virtual tour of the temple, and he sees what's happening there in his absence, and it is not good. In the outer courtyard in front of the temple, he sees this large idol statue. And then he sees the elders of Israel worshiping other gods, both outside and inside the temple. And then he sees the women of Israel. They're worshiping a Babylonian god named Tammuz. And the vision ends with God's glorious throne chariot moving up and away from the temple. It's leaving, going east, headed towards Babylon. And so in chapter 11, we come to see why and how God's glory appeared to Ezekiel there in Babylon. Israel's idolatry and their covenant violations, it's become so blatant and offensive that God has left his temple. They've driven him away, and he consigns it to destruction. But God hasn't abandoned his people. Rather, he goes into exile with them. And so at the end of this vision in chapter 11, God promises that he will return a remnant of Israel back to the land, and he'll transform them by removing their heart of stone and giving them a new, soft heart of flesh, so that they can love and truly follow their God after all. This is a small glimmer of hope, and it's quickly submerged under the reality of the imminent destruction. But chapter 11, it's a key transition, and it helps us understand how the rest of the book has been designed. So the next 3 sections are all announcements of God's judgment, first on Israel, then on the nations around Israel, and then on Jerusalem itself. But then after that, the hopeful conclusion of chapter 11 gets developed in the final 3 sections of the book. First, hope for Israel, then for the nations, and then for all creation. Chapters 12 through 24 focus on God's judgment coming to Israel. And this is a diverse collection of poems and essays. And here Ezekiel shows his fondness for parable and allegory. So he depicts Israel as a burnt, useless stick, or as a rebellious wife, or as a dangerous, raging lion that gets captured, or as 2 promiscuous sisters. These are all depictions of Israel's senseless rebellion and idolatry that results in their ruin. In this section, Ezekiel also acts like a lawyer. He begins arguing the case that, first of all, Jerusalem's destruction is truly deserved after centuries of covenant violation, and that even if the most righteous people in the world, like Noah or Daniel or Job, were alive and praying for God to spare Israel, God would not accept their prayers. It's far too late. And so God's goodness actually demands that he bring justice on this generation of Israel. The exile has become inevitable. They've reached the point of no return. Following this, Ezekiel focuses first on the nations immediately around Israel, and then on the 2 most powerful states in the region, Egypt and then Tyre. Israel has allied with these nations and adopted their gods and their idols, and so God accuses the kings of Tyre and Egypt for arrogantly viewing themselves as gods who get to define right and wrong on their own terms. And God holds these kings accountable for their pride, and he announces that he will use Babylon to bring them down. They will face God's justice along with everybody else. Following these really intense sections is a short story in chapter 33. Ezekiel's met by a refugee who's just arrived from Jerusalem, and he gives him the report that Babylon has attacked the city of Jerusalem, that the city has fallen, and the temple is destroyed. Ezekiel's grim warnings have become a reality. But remember, the end of chapter 11, that's not the end of the story. And so in the next video, we'll explore Ezekiel's profound vision of hope. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Ezekiel.
So the Babylonians took the Ark of the Covenant.
So, when we just.
If the temple was destroyed, they took the Ark, didn't they?
I believe so.
I was just making sense.
Because remember when Cyrus then, so you put that in your treasury. All, the candlesticks, the candlesticks, I think they had china sets, so that when they did feasts,
Mantas, all that.
everybody could come and get their plate, and so part of that was the grand tradition. Those were silver, and then that's all part of your treasury. And so if you conquer a nation, you plunder their temples, because that's where the good stuff is. Just like they used to do in Europe, right? You plunder a monastery, and then you take the crosses and the sticks, all and the artwork, and I think then that's passed on to Cyrus later on too. And he gives that, remember that list we reviewed when the exiles are coming back to Jerusalem? He gives them a lot of that stuff because he knows it belongs in the temple.
Kind of to that point, though, that's a little strange, because if the Israelites had false gods set up in the temple, or is that just a vision? So I'm assuming he's envisioning that those idols, those Canaanite idols, and that women, that's literal.
No,
So
I don't
that's
think so.
figurative.
I think it's figurative, but that's what's happening out in the world.
Right, okay.
It's what's actually happening, but not in the temple. And I say that because it wasn't until the Maccabees during that period, when the Romans did set up their gods in the temple, and that was called the Great Abomination. Now, it's one thing to worship a god 1 mile down the road, but once you put that god right into the center of the temple, then it's just too glaring. It's just too.
Okay. That makes more sense.
The other thing, first of all, what are the impressions you get from watching this? I think in general, we're not conversant too much with Ezekiel, other than the dry bones. And of course, the 4 creatures, but usually we know them more through Revelation than we do through Ezekiel. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Rick, also, this, as Yogi Berra would say, this looks like deja vu all over again. We keep seeing the same repetition of the same things. Like nobody's learning from one generation to the next. Hey, I'm gonna write down the learning principles. Here's here are the do's and the don'ts. Here are the best practices. And, we can't keep making this mistake all over again. It's like, haven't I read this before?
I think that's part of the storyline too, that when they come back, remember, from Babylon, Josiah's reform, you want to look at that again, because they've forgotten all this stuff. You're right. Now it's written down, but they are not reading their books anymore. And remember, he's going through the temple, he finds the Torah, finds the Pentateuch, and he reads it and he's going, oh my goodness.
Right.
And so he calls this time of repentance, and he calls everyone back to, let's just put the stories, the principles that he.
No, it's like, was it Henry Ford who said, he who does not read history will repeat it? It's the same thing,
Yep. Now, what else did you see in this that maybe?
I just have a question about the remnant. I just have a question.
For it or against it?
I want to know who.
Who is the remnant?
Am I the remnant? Let's say.
That's a bigger question.
Yeah, I know.
There's two questions there, I think. One is who's the remnant? And then what is the remnant? I put it a little differently. Saved for. It's not about salvation, I don't think here. It's about saved for what, right? So It's not bragging rights, because Israel will always have bragging rights. Well, we're the chosen people, right? And
Spread the word.
we have this storyline that they don't live up to their calling as the chosen people. So it's always for what was the elect called and saved. So you're being brought back to Jerusalem. That's salvation in a sense, but then for what? And if you're not clear on that, you're gonna get lost again. I mean, that's this perpetual story. Mhm. So there's the image of the stump. Remember we had in Isaiah where you got the shoot, which is the line of David. So it's basically a promise there will be a remnant from the line of David. Right? So that's I think why Matt, the Joachim is important. But why Jesus makes such a point of I'm part of the line. We get these genealogies at the beginning of Matthew and Luke to prove I'm part of that remnant, because they knew the remnant had to be David's line. I mean, that's kind of the part of the storyline. So if you can't prove you're in that genealogy, then maybe you don't have your resume in order.
But these poor creatures, I don't get it. What is that? I mean, he's so explicit about describing them, but I have no clue as to what it means.
And the wheels.
And that's what I was gonna ask. I'm sorry I was late. Did you discuss the wheel?
Yeah, we solved that. That was good. Yeah.
Well,
No, we didn't.
Firestone.
Yeah, I've been trying to find the old gospel hymn and I can't find the words, Ezekiel saw the wheel way in the middle of, I can't remember the rest of the words.
I think that's a Methodist hymn.
I'm gonna try and bring it next week. 'Cause I'm looking
However,
at it.
why would we be interested in that song and in that story here at Emmanuel? One of our 6 windows in the
That's the wheel.
sanctuary is dominated by Ezekiel's wheel. Not the wheel of fortune, but the wheel of fire. So Ezekiel actually in our windows plays a very important role. Unfortunately, it's the back one right by the organist, right by where Kathleen plays the organ, and it's hidden
Yeah.
by a speaker.
Oh, no.
So the creation window is hidden in the back, if you're facing the back. The one to the right is creation, and the one is the ascension, where you've got Ezekiel, actually Elijah, not Ezekiel, Elijah. That wheel of fire is very important there.
To that point, I think, Fran, a few times in scripture, you get a glimpse into what the majesty of you get a glimpse into what the majesty of God might look like, right? There's times where Moses asked God to show up for him, and he said, "You can't handle it, but I'll stick you in the cleft of the rock." Remember, and then he moves by him. So there's these glimpses, and then it's interesting because in other places, especially in Revelations, it starts to talk about like what the glory of God might look like, right? And so to me, this is just what is kind of exciting because he gets a glimpse of what the glory of God might look like.
What?
And then even in this case, I was wondering how they were going to draw it. You know what I mean? And that's kind of the first time I thought that drawing helped me because I could see these are a lot of words, and then you put the majesty of God on top of it. And then in the end, he said that was moving away from the temple, which to me kind of ties again that imagery in this book.
So I'm going to come back and ask you about glory in a second, but some artists depict this as the sense of the 4 corners of the world. So it's a universal vision. Others later on, after the New Testament, hook each of these winged creatures to one of the Gospels. So I can't remember which ones are associated with which, but there's one of the winged creatures with Matthew, one with Mark, and that's historical. So if you'll see that in the European Art Museum, you'll know if there's a specific creature, it's tied to a specific gospel.
And the cherub over the ark, right?
Two cherubs.
Was very, very descriptive.
whose wings are also covering over the presence of God. Now, Jim, how were you taught about the glory? Remember you talked about COVID? That's not the word I always associate. So I have to go back and study this. I was always associated God's glory with the Shekinah glory, which is the glory that shows up in the tabernacle first, when they finally finish the tabernacle. Remember, there's just this massive glory that fills the tabernacle. Same thing happens when David finished, or when Solomon finishes the temple. The glory fills the temple. It's these overwhelming stories of, wind and flame, and people could see it and feel it.
Very, very similar. And then, of course, dragging it all the way to a little bit of the transfiguration. You get this.
That's right.
That story was always told to me. Here's a little glimpse of the majesty, the glory of God. And then, of course, you travel to Revelations and you're seeing and hearing these beings again.
Where did they expect? The reason I tell the story is it plays a very important role when they rebuild the temple. Ezra and Nehemiah, they rebuild the temple, and they're expecting the glory to once again show up, because in all their stories, the glory of God shows up in the tabernacle, in the first temple. And the descriptions of the opening service in the new temple, the rebuilt temple, didn't show up. And there's this massive disappointment of what's going on. This just wasn't what we expected. I mean, we've always read God shows up, and so there's something in that storyline of God's glory when it shows up and when it doesn't show up. And like you said, when Jesus, all of a sudden, transfiguration, and even in his death, things are happening,
But I also think about a lot of times when they talk about the glory of God, sometimes it's not in all the fire and glory, it's in the moment of silence. Because sometimes there's so much distraction that you're not being receptive to God. When I say you generically, I think that we look for this big burst of fireworks or whatever, but God is so powerful. He can come in any form, any way, quiet, silence, noise, but we have to hear him.
That's the Elijah story.
Right.
Although that story is always, it's a bit complex, because he hears God in the silence, remember, not in the storms. But he's in a disobedience at that time. I mean, he's on the way out. Remember that story? He's fleeing God in that cave, and he's refusing to do the mandate. So basically, God says, okay, I'll give you one more thing to do, which is go to Elisha and give your mantle to him, because you're toast. As a prophet, I think that's his last hurrah. So it's very interesting how God speaks to him in the last hurrah, so to speak, before his retirement, in silence. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. All right, are we ready to discuss this then in our groups? We'll take a couple minutes, and for those who are joining us online, we'll put you in those groups as well. We'll only go about 10 minutes, okay? And then we'll bring it back in plenary. And I do that because I think this was a tougher book. This has a harder access point, I think, than some of the other books that we've had. All right?
It's quite long. It's quite long. You want to go over here? Join them?
Did we wave to everybody? Say hi to everybody.
Oh, and hi.
A couple, just brief announcements before I ask you what you saw. First of all, Ellen Wolf did die last night. So Edie Julie is going to contact you. She went over there, but she had already passed.
I have to tell you why Ellen means so much to me. When David and I first came to Emmanuel and started our nursing home ministry, we had had a nursing home ministry for years and years in Columbus, and just started it down here. and we went to Brookside or Dale or somewhere. That was our first place. And, you know, we were kind of apprehensive. Was this really where the Lord wanted us to be? And would anybody come? And we walked in and there was dear Ellen with the biggest smile, wearing her Emmanuel pin.
Oh.
And I said, oh, Ellen, you just don't know what that did for David and me. You know, just gave us the confidence and so forth. And she's always just had such a special place in my heart. And Bibi had a wonderful sermon a couple of weeks ago, and she had sheaves of wheat. So I took one of those wheat and took it to Ellen and gave it
Oh,
to her, you know, and that was, well, that was the last time. I saw
Ellen,
her.
what was it, 2 months ago? Celebrated her 100th birthday.
Yeah, I know.
All right.
So you just don't get many.
Man.
who can,
And when we went to see her that day, I mean, she was so lucid. I mean, she told us all these stories. We talked about Betty Betham, you know, and, you know, she was just so alert and we had a wonderful time
So
together.
we'll talk to Jerry, her son, about seeing, I think they're gonna want some sort of memorial or funeral service pretty quickly.
And I would like to be for her.
The second item is to promote the Sunday Forum again this week. It's a tougher one, which is why I'm promoting it. We're trying our third film, and the film is called Sound of Freedom. Has anyone seen the film?
Yes.
Yeah, I heard about it.
Okay, Edie, I think that's, you know, I mentioned this at Worship Matters. And some people want to see it because they just want to know more about human trafficking and child trafficking. Others don't want to go because it just rips their heart apart,
Oh, yeah.
just rips them apart. So part of what I hope is that our Sunday Forum, it's 10 minutes, is informative about what's happening, especially because in Florida, we're kind of part of the problem here, a big part of the problem. We're of the 3 states of 10 largest states, we're the 3rd where human trafficking is taking place, and the city that's has the worst record of human trafficking is not Miami, it's Tampa. Which when I thought about it, makes some sense. It's just a little easier to cross the Gulf rather than just circle around the Atlantic, I guess. So it's telling that story. I know Jim has really, was really touched by the film. Gina, I know, has talked to me too, that I knew that she had seen the film and found it hard. Important. But, you know, even, I don't know if I can sit through it, you know, just to watch a child being trafficked. Now, it's PG-13, I think. It's not violent or anything.
No.
It's just the story, just a child's
The
being
Sound of Freedom.
trapped. Sound of Freedom. What's the name of the movie again, Jim?
The Sound of Freedom, and I watched.
What's the name of the movie again?
Pastor Rick, Sounds of Freedom,
Okay.
and there's an inside joke there. But I watched Rick's video
I
on
did
it. It's
too.
11 minutes. It's a phenomenal job. And you really, what I like is, well, there's there's a couple little clips on there.
Yeah.
And then there's also 4 ways that we can do something, which I think are great, that we can all do. So it's hard to think about what can I do in light of this situation, right? So great job on that.
Thanks.
And down here, of course, in our local sheriff's department, there is a whole department that specializes in that. And there are typically at least a half a dozen cases in Collier County each week of folks of all ages. And the Shelter for Abused Women and Children is the lead community partner in working with those that are that they help to get out of the trafficking situations. So, and just as an aside, we had here at Emmanuel Lutheran Church, an individual who had been coming regularly, who was actually literally being trafficked. Yeah. So, you know,
It's real.
yeah, and the image that we have, it can be significantly broader than what we typically think.
Or it'd be great to maybe have someone from the sheriff's department come and speak to us.
Yeah.
Sure, of course, we can coordinate that.
As I was leaving Ohio, my alma mater, Otterbein and AAUW were trying to collect money to buy a house to house these people. And I am so ashamed to say that one of the biggest ports for this is Toledo, Ohio, because it's, you know, off the beaten path, but it's the St. Lawrence Seaway and gets in that way.
Yeah, I was sensitized to this a little bit in Minneapolis, because the Mall of America is one of the ponds where traffickers go to fish. And because they know what sells, and what sells are blondes. So they go up north to Minnesota and go downtown, but also go to the Mall of America, where they think young kids who, have nothing, or might be more disillusioned and vulnerable, would be. So I think that part of this too is one of the statistics at the end, and I'm not sure it's completely historically accurate, but it's important nevertheless. I think it's more referring to the United States than to the world. And I'm thinking Ezekiel here, is that there are more slaves today in the world out there, people working in servitude and slavery, than there was during the time of slavery.
Times X, times X. It's huge.
So and part of that is this tradition of Israel, where we should become sensitive to this. And Jews have often speak in that sense too of we got to deal with this issue, because remember, we were once slaves back in Egypt. We were once in exile in Babylon. And when you've experienced that as a people, you'll notice in their liturgies, this stuff of human trafficking comes up a lot, because that's their history. They embrace it, they say it was awful, and now we've got to do something about it, because remember when we, right? But by the grace of God, type of thing. So that's kind of important to think we all, the horrors of slavery, obviously, in and around the Civil War, that's part of our issue as well. This seems to be that on steroids.
We had a doctor who used to come here. I'm sure many of you remember her. She sang. She has a beautiful soprano voice, OBGYN. I think her first name was Carice, and she recorded. She was in the Naples News last week. She had like a huge column on this. She's still very much actively involved with children. That's her life cause. So yeah, it's right around us, and it's here. It's here.
So let's go. What did you discover about Ezekiel in your groups that you can bring to the plenary here?
Yeah, Kitty.
No.
You're so smart.
It's your job.
No, we gathered up and had a good group, and we were just kind of, I don't know, we were talking about a lot of powerful things in this, the imagery, of course, right? And we're all thinking about the dry bones being given flesh, but that's next week. And then Robert talked about, the Spirit of God. Why is it that we continually fall away? What is that force that is always pressing on people to turn away from God? You know what I mean? What is this force that when you have a holy leader, Josiah, the people rallied around doing what's right. And when you have evil or leaders who are leaderless, you tend to slide away pretty quick.
Other things you want to bring?
We talked about the fact that things are displayed so dramatically, and that kind of throws you. And we think it had to do with the fact that people couldn't read, so you depict things in a more dramatic way to get your message across. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes that didn't work either.
Notice that he tied himself up, that street theater was the scapegoat tradition. And so I have to go back and figure out now how who's the scapegoat here, and who's being punished for what reason, justly or unjustly. This is the tradition where the group sins, communal sins, are then placed on the goat. Remember, the one goat is sent out to the wilderness, the other goat is slaughtered. And so that's always been fascinating to me. Why two goats? Two aspects of the image here. And we often say the goat was innocent. And that's what we usually mean, when the coach is fired, oh, he's just a scapegoat.
Right.
Meaning he had to take the sins of the whole bad performance of the team, and now we got rid of him. That often means you don't have to deal with the sins of the football team.
Right.
Because you put all the sins on one person or a CEO, just get rid of the CEO and then you can kind of start over. So it's an interesting tradition he's talking about. Notice this week when you're reading the second part, one is, notice the judgment is not just against Judah, it's also against the nations.
Everybody involved.
So hope is also going to be expressed to Judah in returning, but also to the nations and even to all of creation. So it's really interesting that Ezekiel's vision goes beyond just the internal, God's going to save us.
Yeah.
We're the remnant.
Right.
Now God's salvation is for all nations. We're kind of breaking out of that, again, trap that I think Jesus got himself into last week. I'm just called to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now we can say that's not Isaiah, that's not Ezekiel. So that's kind of cool, I think. Team for a Canaanite. So look for that hopefulness. The last part of Ezekiel, I think, is much more fun to read for that reason. So anything else there? Son of man. Go ahead.
One of the motifs of Ezekiel is God's presence everywhere. The big shock for the Jews in being transferred to Babylon was that they lose their God because he resided in the temple. And Ezekiel and others let them learn that God was present in Babylon just as much as he was present in Jerusalem.
It's a great point because we've sort of accepted that. So it's hard to read back into the text where that was not accepted. God was a God of place, not universal. Part of the reason we can worship a God who's everywhere is because of these stories. God's breaking out of the temple, basically. Being the God that can be worshipped even in Babylon.
And he lives within us. Emmanuel is with us.
Anything else? All right, let's again close with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, your beauty fills the temple, beauty fills our hearts, and we thank you that indeed you are universal God whose presence is everywhere. And we thank you for these stories. We pray that we could go deeper into the stories so that we might understand your mercy and grace, not just your judgment, but also the hope of your mercy, more for our church and for our own lives, for our own world. Be with us now. Bless us. We pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Dwight, Ann, great to see you. Barbara, Jan, blessings all.
You know what? I said I had to leave it here.